r/nosleep. Posted by u/Carl1961. I was forced to solve a Rubik's Cube in order to escape a locked room. 1. The Zip Recruiter ad struck me as being a little odd. Wanted, volunteers to participate in independent study related to solving puzzles. Must be 18 plus. No special qualifications needed. Participants will be compensated for their time in the amount of $10,000. Below that, there was a phone number. I sat there in front of my laptop mulling it over for a while, trying to get the sense of it. Independent study, solving puzzles. $10,000. Yeah, it seemed a little weird. But this was Zip Recruiter, a legitimate job posting site. If it had been Craigslist, that would have been a different matter, and even if it did seem slightly unusual, there was nothing about the ad that jumped out at me as being overtly sketchy. I figured maybe it was a marketing team wanting to test out some new toy they were releasing, or something innocuous of that sort. I figured I could at least look into it, and if it seemed like a scam, I could always back out. Besides, I was pretty desperate for funds, being a 20-something unemployed recent college graduate with a ton of debts. My rent was coming due, my parents were too broke themselves to help me out, and, due to the ongoing pandemic, the job market in my particular field was currently at a slump. I needed some cash, and quick. I dialed the number listed below the ad and a cool, professionally emotionless female voice promptly answered. Yes? I told her I had seen the online ad looking for volunteers, and she asked me a few perfunctory questions, my name, age, occupation, etc. I answered her questions and asked a few of my own, specifically the name of the company or organization conducting the study and what exactly the study would consist of, but she told me she was afraid she was not at liberty to disclose any information of that sort over the phone, although a representative would be able to answer me in person if I chose to partake in the experiment. All of that should have raised a red flag right then and there, especially her use of the word experiment, but like I said, I was broke and desperate, so my empty wallet overruled my common sense. I told her, sure. She gave me an address, a date and a time, all of which I jotted down, then I thanked her and hung up. 2 days later I took a bus downtown to the address she had given me. It was a perfectly nondescript office building. Nothing suspicious or sinister about it in the slightest. I took an elevator to the floor she had given me and stepped out into an ordinary looking, if rather bland, reception area. A pretty young receptionist around my age greeted me with a polite smile. I told her my name and she checked her computer. She spoke into the headset she was wearing, telling someone I was here, then asked me to take a seat in the waiting area and that a Miss Norton would be with me shortly. I did as she said, picking up an issue of People from the stack of magazines on the table, and flipped through it idly. I glanced around the waiting area with casual curiosity as I waited. On the wall, a TV was showing a daytime soap opera. There were only 3 other people besides me, an overweight, balding middle-aged man, a acne-faced kid with glasses who looked like he had just turned 18, and a thin woman in her early 30s. All of them patiently waiting along with me to be seen. About 5 minutes later I was approached by a somewhat plain but intelligent-looking woman in her 40s wearing a smart pantsuit. She identified herself as Miss Norton and shook my hand, then led me down a hallway into her office. I sat in front of her desk and she sat behind it. She asked me some basic questions that were essentially the same ones I had answered over the phone the other day. Then she opened a folder and picked up a pen. She told me she was going to give me a pre-testing evaluation, and based on the answers I gave her she would be able to determine if I was an eligible candidate for whatever study it was they were conducting. I answered her questions, all of which seemed related to solving puzzles. Was I a fan of puzzles? Did I have any experience solving puzzles? Was I any good at it? I told her no to all of them, feeling slightly amused/bewildered. I had grown up in the digital age and had been raised on video games and computers. Puzzles were what my grandparents had grown up playing. She wrote down my answers on a form as I answered them, asking me next if I had any experience working under duress and how well I handled stressful situations, then if I had any mental illnesses or a history of mental instability in my family. These questions made me frown slightly. They seemed strange and I couldn't see what they had to do with solving puzzles, but I figured they were some kind of fine print formality they were obligated to ask. I answered them truthfully to the best of my ability. After about 20 minutes, she closed her file and looked up at me, seeming satisfied. She told me it appeared I was eligible for their study and congratulated me. She went across her office to a small refrigerator and removed a bottle of water, which she offered me. I politely declined, not feeling particularly thirsty. She seemed to scowl for a split second at my rejection of the drink, but her professional smile returned so quickly I was left to assume I had imagined it. I finally got around to addressing the elephant in the room and asked her, "So what exactly is this study you're doing?" We're just looking for individuals to solve some puzzles in a controlled environment. It's a kind of psychological behavioral experiment, I suppose you could say. That was when I started getting leery. Controlled environment? Psychological behavioral experiment? What the fuck was this? How long will this thing take? I asked her, cocking an eyebrow. A week. A week in a controlled environment solving puzzles as some kind of psychological behavioral experiment? I felt my unease increase. That was when I decided to bail out. I'm having second thoughts about this whole thing, I told her, starting to rise from my chair. I don't think I want to be a part of this. Thanks anyway, Miss Norton. Sorry for wasting your time. In the blink of an eye her smile disappeared, replaced with that menacing scowl I thought I had detected earlier. Her eyes were blank, soulless. I'm afraid it's too late to back out, now, she told me in a frighteningly emotionless monotone, and, almost casually, reached over and pushed a button on her desk I hadn't noticed before. Look, I protested, fighting to sound calm even though I could feel panic threatening to overwhelm me. I never signed any contract, so, that was as far as I got. Behind me, I heard the office door burst open. I spun around in time to see two huge men in dark suits charging at me. One got behind me and put me in a headlock, the other fumbled a hypodermic needle out of his jacket. Let me go, I shouted, struggling uselessly. This would have gone a lot easier if you had just drunk the water, Miss Norton told me coldly. I felt a stinging prick of pain in my arm. Instantly, the room started spinning around me. My vision grew hazy. Then it all went black. 2. I woke up. It took a moment for my head to clear, then slowly I sat up and looked around, perplexed. I wasn't in Miss Norton's office. In fact, I didn't even think I was in the same building. I was in a small, dingy cinderblock room with dirty gray walls, a single steel door and no windows. The room was only about 10 feet square. There was a fluorescent light fixture in the ceiling. On the wall was a digital timer, or maybe some kind of clock, with all the numbers currently frozen at 0. 000:00:00. A video camera was mounted high in one corner of the room. Besides all that, the only other feature in the room was a small wooden desk and a chair. There was only one object on the desk. I stood up and wobbled unsteadily over to it, still feeling somewhat dizzy and disoriented. I studied the small, multicolored square object for some time, utterly baffled. It was a Rubik's Cube. It had already been scrambled, that is to say, all the colors had been mixed together. I stood there for several seconds, looking at the Rubik's Cube, in a surreal daze, feeling like a man hallucinating in the grip of a fever dream. What the fuck? I murmured out loud. Suddenly a deafeningly loud voice spoke, seemingly from out of nowhere. I jumped, startled. Subject will commence solving the puzzle. I jerked my head around, looking for the source of the voice. The voice boomed again, coming from all around me. It was a terrifying voice, electronically altered, flat and inhuman and unnaturally deep, void of all emotion. It repeated. Subject will commence solving the puzzle. I spotted tiny mesh grills in the ceiling. Speakers, I found my voice. What the fuck's going on? I demanded. Where the fuck am I? Who are you and what do you want? Subject will commence solving the puzzle, the voice said for the third time, ignoring my questions. Or what? I challenged, what the fuck are you going to do? Look at the timer on the wall, the voice ordered me. I looked. As I did, the timer suddenly came to life, the numbers switching from zeros to 168 hours 0 minutes 0 seconds. As I watched, the numbers changed to 167 hours 59 minutes 59 seconds. The last two digits were rapidly counting downwards. 59, 58, 57, 56. You have 168 hours to solve the puzzle. If you succeed you will be released. If you fail to solve the puzzle before the timer reaches 0, the room you are in will be filled with poison gas. For a moment I didn't even know how to react. I think I actually barked out a bemused laugh. I couldn't take this situation seriously, it was too weird, too ridiculous. Someone had kidnapped me and put me in some mysterious room and were threatening to kill me, if I didn't solve a Rubik's Cube in a week. Someone had to be playing some sick, elaborate joke on me. Is that so? I retorted, looking into the video camera mounted in the corner. So all I have to do is figure out this stupid little fucking box. I gestured to the Rubik's Cube and you'll let me go? The voice didn't answer. I chuckled sarcastically. Whoever you people are, you have way too much time on your hands. At least you're not asking me to cut my foot off with a hacksaw. I went to the steel door and turned the knob. As I had suspected, it was locked. I looked down. At the bottom of the door was a rectangular slot with a sliding door, the kind you see in the doors of solitary confinement cells for the guards to pass prisoners their meals. I tried to open it, but it was also locked from the outside. I searched my pockets, but all my possessions, phone, wallet, keys, had been removed while I was unconscious. Shit, I muttered. I looked again at the digital timer on the wall. 167 hours 56 minutes 37 seconds. With no other options, I decided to play along, still affecting a cavalier attitude, in denial over how dear my situation was. I looked into the video camera. Okay, whatever you guys want. But the first thing I'm doing when I get out of this room is going to the cops. No answer. I went to the desk and sat down. I picked up the Rubik's Cube and turned it over in my hands, examining it. I had never played with one of these things, but I was familiar with them. When I was a teen, my older brother had one. He had spent most of one summer trying to solve it, only to finally give up and toss it aside in frustrated disgust. 6 sides, each comprised of 9 smaller cubes in rows of 3. Each side a different color: red, blue, yellow, orange, green and white. It didn't seem like it would be too difficult to figure out. My brother couldn't solve one, but he'd been a jock with no patience or discipline for these kind of things. All I had to do was match the colors on each side. How hard could it be? I figured a couple hours, 3 tops. I shrugged and got started. I sat down the Rubik's Cube and leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes and rubbing my temples. I was getting a headache. I glanced at the timer on the wall. 163 hours 44 minutes 5 seconds. I groaned. It had been 4 hours. 4 hours dicking around with this stupid fucking thing, and I still had made no headway in solving it. It was turning out to be a lot harder than I had anticipated. I realized I was thirsty. And hungry. I looked at the camera. Hey, I shouted. How about getting some food in here, and something to drink? There was no answer over the speakers, but a few minutes later, I heard a metallic rattling sound coming from behind me and spun around. The small hatch covering the slot at the bottom of the steel door was sliding away. A bottle of water was pushed through by an unseen hand, then the hatch slid shut and I heard someone relock it from the other side. I went over and picked up the water bottle. I twisted off the cap and gulped it down. Great, I said, now how about some chow to go with it? I waited, but the hatch wasn't reopened and a food tray passed into the room. Hey, I said in a louder voice, did you hear me? I'm getting hungry. Send in some food. I waited. Nothing. Habla singles? I said, getting irritated. Get me some fucking food. Minutes passed. The hatch remained closed. No one came. I stood there, disquieted. My bravado had been gradually fading over the last few hours, and I was starting to feel really scared for the first time. My predicament was starting to seem real, and not the plot of some trite psychological thriller, a bad horror movie cliché I hadn't been able to fully accept as fact. Listen, I said, the anger gone from my voice, now almost a plea, I need to eat. If you want me to be in shape to solve the puzzle, you have to feed me. But my appeals for sustenance fell on deaf ears. They weren't going to feed me, I realized. They would provide me with water to keep me from dying of thirst, but no food. They would let me go hungry until I found the solution to that goddamn Rubik's Cube. I glanced at it, sitting on the table, but I didn't feel like fiddling around with it anymore for a while. I was tired. I had no idea what time it was, I had no watch, there were no clocks in the room, and I had no idea how long I had been unconscious before I had awakened here, but I needed some rest. I looked around. There was no bed, I would have to sleep on the floor. I lay down, curling up on my side, and eventually drifted off into a troubled sleep. I opened my eyes. I sat up. The first thing I did was glance at the timer. 155 hours 27 minutes 12 seconds. I did the math in my head. I had a little less than 6.5 days to get out of here. I had to urinate, my bladder felt like it was going to burst. It only dawned on me then that there was no toilet in the room with me. Hey, I shouted at the speakers in the ceiling, I have to piss. Can I get a bucket or something in here? No reply. What? I demanded, you want me to just piss on the floor? No reply. I realized, disgusted, that was exactly what I was going to have to do. I went to one corner of the room and unzipped my pants. After I was done, I crossed back to the table and sat down. 6.5 days, but I would see to it that I solved the cube well before then. I would do it today. I would start afresh and keep at it until I got it done. I picked it up in both hands and began. Yes, yes, yes. 2 rows of solid red. I just needed to complete the bottom row. I turned the bottom, fuck. I tossed it down, furious, my pulse throbbing. I hadn't realized before just how intricate these fucking things were, how interconnected they were, how matching the colors on one side would simply knock the colors on another out of alignment. It was only later, after it was over, that I learned that there were a total of 43 quintillion, yes, you read that correctly, 43 quintillion, different possible combinations in a Rubik's Cube. If I had known that at the time, I would have been fucked. The hopelessness of my situation would have overwhelmed me and I would have given up, curled into a corner and waited to die. But I didn't, and my ignorance was the only thing that saved me. I also learned about algorithms, certain patterns and sequences which, when followed, will solve the Rubik's Cube in no time flat. There are actually professional Rubik players out there who have it down to a science and can find the solution in just a few minutes. One kid in a video I saw on YouTube even figured out his cube in just 25 seconds. But I knew none of this at the time. I was a novice and was flying blind, having to wing it and learn through trial and error. I looked at the timer on the wall. 143 hours 11 minutes 26 seconds. 12 hours. I had been sitting here for 12 hours and had accomplished nothing. My fear was slowly giving way to panic. I could feel it gnawing on my nerves with tiny teeth, as if I was being eaten alive by a swarm of mice. I stood up, stretching to get the crimps out of my muscles, then began to pace the small room, forcing myself to remain calm and resolute. There had to be a solution to this. I just had to stay focused, stay diligent. I still had almost 6 days left, plenty of time. I could do it. I called for a bottle of water and it was promptly delivered through the slot in the door. I gulped it down, tossed the empty in the corner, then went back to the desk. I worked at it another 2 hours, but was no closer to my objective. Disturbed and exhausted, I lay down and eventually slept. My eyes blazed with concentration and determination. I was getting there, finally getting there. Almost done, almost. I turned the top and stared victoriously at the box in my hand. I had completed the yellow side. 9 solid yellow squares in 3 rows of 3. I had done it. My joy was short-lived when I turned the Rubik's Cube over and saw that the other 5 sides were still a meaningless jumble of multicolored squares. It didn't make any sense. No fucking sense. You would think solving one side would cause the others to automatically fall into place. With trembling hands I sat down the cube and looked slowly, with dread, at the timer. 119 hours 36 minutes 48 seconds. Less than 5 days remaining. I stood up and went to the corner to relieve myself into the widening puddle of urine. When I was done, I began to look methodically around the room for anything I might have overlooked before, something that could be useful in escaping from here. Nothing. Nothing I hadn't seen before. Dirty gray cinderblock walls, a steel door, a video camera high in the corner, recording my every move, a wooden desk and a chair. And the Rubik's Cube. The goddamn motherfucking Rubik's Cube. I stopped and wondered something. I looked down. The bottom of the walls were lined with triple rows of small slits, each about 4 inches long and no more than a 1/4 inch wide. At first I had presumed they were for ventilation, but now something was nagging at the back of my mind. I crouched down and peered intently into one of the slits. On the other side I could just dimly see a copper nozzle. I stood, went to another wall, and checked it. More copper nozzles. They were behind all of the slits. That was where the gas was going to come from. The poison gas that would fill this room in less than 5 days and end my life. A wave of overwhelming terror and despair enveloped me. Up until then I had still, on some level, been in denial. Had been thinking their threat was merely a bluff, a way to intimidate me into going along with their sick game, to goad me into solving the puzzle, and they hadn't really been serious about killing me. Now I saw they meant what they had said. My already fragile composure collapsed and I had a total meltdown. Screaming, wailing, I flailed wildly around the room in a panic, then lunged at the steel door and began to hammer my fists against it. "Let me out!" I screamed, "Let me out, you sick fucks! Let me the fuck out or I'm going to kick this door down and stomp your fucking asses!" I slammed my weight against the door and kicked it over and over to no avail. It didn't budge a single millimeter. It was solid steel and God only knew how thick. It was like pounding against the door of a bank vault. At last, exhausted, I slid down the door, leaving red trails from my bleeding hands, into a sitting position, weeping quietly in despair. I was going to die in this room like a rat in a trap. A human guinea pig in some twisted experiment I didn't even know the meaning of. I sat there and sobbed. Eventually I passed out. I scratched distractedly at the 3 days' growth of beard stubble on my cheeks, then turned my attention back to the Rubik's Cube, trying to ignore the stench of my own urine. The floor was littered with empty water bottles and the puddle of urine in the corner was now over 4 feet wide. I paid no attention to the growing hunger pains, the rumbling in my stomach. I focused solely on the cube in my hands. Staying focused on the cube helped me keep my mind off my situation, helped keep the fear at bay. It also helped me keep my attention off the room. I was fighting an increasing sense of claustrophobia. Each hour it seemed like the room I was trapped in was shrinking slightly, growing smaller a little at a time. I darted a quick glance at the timer. 095:06:25. Less than 4 days left. It was hopeless, and I knew it. The box was too complex. It thwarted my every attempt at breaking its enigma. Sometimes it seemed like it was actively mocking me, teasing me with a possible solution, only to dash my hopes in the next maneuver. It was haunting my dreams, nightmares where I found myself trapped in a bizarre M.C. Escher landscape of impossible angles that were constantly revolving, the ceiling reversing position with the floor, the walls reversing position with the ceiling. I manipulated the Rubik's Cube, turning the right side backward, but it was another dead end. I snapped. That was it, that was fucking IT. I had had enough of this bullshit. I was not going to give these sadistic sons of bitches the satisfaction of watching me lose my mind trying to pass their test. I was done. With a primal shout of rage, I hurled the Rubik's Cube against the cinderblock wall as hard as I possibly could. It shattered into 100 pieces. I stood up, laughing maniacally, defiantly, and looked into the camera. There, I shouted, "How do you like that, huh? How do you fucking like that? I quit. You hear, I quit. Fuck you and fuck your fucking experiment." After a moment, I heard the rattling of a key turning in a lock. The sliding hatch in the door was pushed aside, and a hand deposited something into the room. A new, pre-scrambled Rubik's Cube. The hatch slid closed. For the first time in days, the deep, flat, electronically disguised voice boomed over the speakers. "Subject will commence solving the puzzle." I stared at the new Rubik's Cube for a moment, blinking in disbelief. Then, furious, picked it up and smashed it against the wall like the first. "Fuck you!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. The hatch slid open. A third Rubik's Cube was dropped into the room. "Subject will commence solving the puzzle." With a frenzied berserker yell, I sent the third Rubik's Cube to Rubik's Cube hell with its 2 prior compatriots. I did the same with the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th. It didn't matter, no matter how many I destroyed, my mysterious captors just patiently sent in a new replacement. And the godlike authoritarian voice issued its tired, unvarying command: "Subject will commence solving the puzzle." After the 10th, I gave up, panting with exertion. The floor was now littered with shards of plastic shrapnel as well as urine and empty bottles. It was pointless. They must have been anticipating such an outburst, must have prepared for any eventuality. For all I knew, they had an entire stockpile of Rubik's Cubes on the other side of the door. I began to giggle hysterically, uncontrollably, near my mental breaking point. They had drugged me, kidnapped me, locked me in a room, deprived me of food and proper sanitation facilities, and were going to gas me to death over a fucking plastic children's toy. Subject will commence solving the puzzle. I sat down resolutely, making no move toward the new cube. I was on strike. They could kill me if they wanted, but I was not touching that fucking thing. Subject will commence solving puzzle or water will be withheld. "Go to hell," I murmured in a shaky, weak voice. I sat there in silence, staring bleakly straight ahead, not moving, while the timer counted steadily down. The only sound was the beating of my heart, which seemed to synchronize with the pace of the timer, counting down the remaining hours of my life. I looked at the timer. 076:53:21. 3 days, 4 hours, 53 minutes and 21 seconds left to live. It had been 18 hours since my outburst. I was thirsty. I had dehydrated myself throwing my tantrum, and it had gotten worse with every passing minute. My mouth was so dry I could hardly even swallow. "Water," I croaked out, looking up at the camera. "Water. Thirsty. Need water." No reply. No water bottle was delivered through the slot. "Please," I begged in a quivering voice, on the verge of tears. "Please, I need water." My pleas were ignored. "All right," I snapped, "all right, I'll solve the puzzle, just please give me some water." I broke down in tears. I crawled over to the Rubik's Cube and picked it up, holding it up to the camera to placate them. I began to work it. A couple minutes later, the hatch was slid open and 2 water bottles were deposited into the locked room. I gulped them both down, one after the other, gasping with gratitude. "Thank you," I whimpered reverently to my captors. They had won. I was broken. There would be no more rebellion. I would play their game until the end. I was sitting in the corner, humming senselessly, huddled over the cube, manipulating it rapidly, with mindless dexterity, so quickly it was just a blur of colors. Top, bottom, right side, left side, back, front. The floor was heaped with empty plastic bottles and bits of shattered plastic. The pool of urine now covered almost the entire floor. Soon I would have to lie in it, soaking in my own waste, in order to sleep, but none of that mattered to me anymore. Neither did the hunger or the reek of my unwashed body and soiled clothes. Neither did the timer on the wall, patiently ticking down however much time I had left. Only one thing mattered, the plastic box in my hand. 6 colors, 6 sides. 54 squares. It encompassed my entire universe, a cube less than 2 inches square. Nothing else mattered, nothing else even existed. Just the box. Even I didn't matter, I was only the solver. The puzzle was what mattered. It was life. It was God. It was all. Top, bottom, right side, left side. 6 colors. 6 sides. 54 squares. Less than 2 inches square. My mind was trapped in the cube in my hands, my body was trapped in the cube that was this room. I was doing random combinations, knowing I had to luck out eventually, a million monkeys on a million typewriters for a million years, or however the fuck that expression goes. I was fatigued from lack of sleep, I had been staying awake for, I didn't know long, fighting exhaustion, dedicating every conscious moment of my being to solving the puzzle. I felt like I could do it, that I was starting to get somewhere. I could still come out of this alive, I just needed more time too. Attention, the voice boomed from the overhead speakers, eliciting a startled gasp from me. It hadn't spoken in what seemed like lifetimes. Exactly 1 hour remains for subject to solve puzzle. Repeat, 1 hour remaining to solve puzzle. I froze in stunned horror. An hour? That was all? No, it was impossible. I still had days left. I had 2. I glanced at the timer. 59:56. No, it couldn't be. My reeling mind protested. They cheated, they must have rigged the timer. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. I had been so engrossed in solving the Rubik's Cube, so absorbed, I had lost track of time. I hadn't looked at the timer in God only knew how long. And now I had simply run out of time. That was all. I looked down at the still unfinished cube in my hands. It seemed to be gloating. I even imagined I could hear it laughing. I sat it down and slumped against the wall in defeat. I felt a weird sense of calm, even serenity. Now that the end was actually in sight, I was resigned to it. I had done the best I could, given it everything I had, and nothing more could be expected from me. I looked up at the camera. Can I have a cigarette? I asked it. I had never smoked before in my life, but now seemed like a good time to take it up. It wasn't like I had to worry about cancer. No answer. Please, I implored calmly. 1 cigarette? A condemned man is entitled to 1 smoke. I didn't expect them to approve my request, but who knows, maybe someone took pity on me. The hatch was slid aside and a single filtered Marlboro and a plain white matchbook containing a single match were placed in the room. I tried to get up but found I was too weak to even stand. I had to crawl to it. Thanks, I muttered. I lit the cigarette and inhaled, coughing harshly on the smoke, but also relishing it and the smell and flavor of the tobacco, knowing these were among the last sensations I would ever feel. I smoked and calmly reflected upon my life, some 23 years of it, and how senselessly it was about to be terminated. I had just wanted to make some quick cash, now I was about to be exterminated all because I couldn't figure out a $10 toy. It was almost funny in a bleak, existential way. I thought about my parents and my brother and sister. I wondered if there would be an afterlife or only eternal oblivion after death. Most of all I wondered if my approaching death would be quick and peaceful or if it would slow and horrific. I dwelt upon a paper I had done for high school history class about the Holocaust and the gas chambers the Nazis had used on their victims. Cyclone B. How it had caused them to convulse and foam at the mouth before they had finally died. I considered committing suicide, a final act of defiance, cheating them of the death they intended for me by doing it myself. I looked around for something I could use. Nothing but shattered Rubik's cubes, empty plastic bottles, urine, and the intact Rubik's cube sitting forever unsolved where I had left it. I cynically thought about shoving it down my throat and asphyxiating on it. I smirked at the idea. I started to look away, then my gaze shot back and locked onto the cube. My eyes widened. I crawled over to it. Something about that pattern, it looked familiar. I picked it up, examining it intently. That sequence of colored squares on one side, yes, I had seen it before, It had kept cropping up during my numerous fruitless attempts to solve the box, had kept giving me the false hope that I was onto something, had. Something clicked in my mind. A realization, no, a revelation. I felt floored as a sense of inspiration struck me, so intense and was nearly transcendental. I felt like a crusader who after a lifetime of searching had finally stumbled upon the Holy Grail. I turned the cube over in my hands, inspecting it. It was as if I was seeing it through a different set of eyes, seeing past the myriad conundrums and complexities it had thrown at me, defying me, thwarting me at every turn. I looked at it, and saw the answer. I saw how it could be done. I glanced at the timer. 0:17:03. 17 minutes. All I had left. One last chance. My heart racing, I began to manipulate the cube, not randomly, but with thoughtful, calculated precision. Come on, come on. I memorized every move I made, every turn, so in case I made a mistake, I would be able to backtrack and correct it without losing progress. I finished the white side. I looked at the timer. 0:09:33. I continued to work. Now the bottom 2 rows were complete. Just the top and one more row left. I could do it, I had to do it. I looked at the timer. 0:04:47. I worked desperately but not impatiently, urgently but not panicked. Every move had to count, there could be no screw-ups, I was almost out of time. Almost done with the yellow side, no, a blue square. How? I must have made a mistake. Got to go back, got it, fix it, there. Yellow side complete. Just one more row, just a few more moves, please, God, someone. I dared a glance at the timer. 0:01:14. Almost out of time. Moment of truth. My hands worked the Rubik's Cube so fast it was just a revolving blur of colors in motion. They seemed to move of their own accord, without the conscious will of my mind, as if my higher brain had shut down and let my subconscious take control. Left, right, front, back, top, bottom. I made a final turn and then stopped. For a frozen, breathless moment, a moment that seemed to stretch out for eternity, I just looked at the box. Then I turned it over and over, examining each side. Solid blue, solid green, solid yellow, solid white, solid orange, solid red. It was done. I looked at the timer. 0:00:00:12. I stood up on my knees, thrusting the completed Rubik's Cube, the salvation in my hands, up at the camera for them to see. I tried to scream in triumph, but only a dry, bird-like squawk issued from my throat. I did it. I rasped at them, I did it, you bastards. I fucking did it, now let me out. Let me ow it. Then I fainted. 3. When I regained consciousness, the first thing I realized was that I was not dead. I sat up and looked around. The second thing I realized was that the timer had stopped. The digits were frozen at 0:00:00:07. The third, and most important, thing I realized was that the steel door was now standing wide open. I looked at the finished Rubik's Cube beside me. I beat you, I rasped at it strengthlessly. I beat you, you son of a bitch. With an immense effort, I forced myself to my feet. I fought a sudden wave of lightheadedness, certain for a moment I was going to faint again, but it passed. I was so weak from hunger, lack of sleep and general mental exhaustion I wasn't sure I would be able to walk. I took a single cautious, staggering step in the direction of the open door, then a second, then a third. As I passed the puddle of urine, I glanced down, catching a glimpse of my reflection in its surface. I stopped, appalled by my appearance. My eyes were bloodshot and crazed, sunken deep in sockets which were ringed with dark circles. My unshaken cheeks were hollow, my face drawn tightly to my skull. My oily, unwashed hair was sticking out wildly in every direction and my clothes were filthy and wrinkled. I reached the doorway but hesitated before stepping through it, suddenly paranoid, wondering if this could be some cruel trick. Maybe they were only letting me think they were releasing me, and the second I stepped through that door I would be killed. But I couldn't stay in here forever. The place stank of stale piss, and I was starving. I willed myself to step outside of the room. My fears were unjustified. There was nobody waiting for me outside the room. In fact, there was no sign of anyone, anywhere. I listened, but heard nothing but my own breathing. I was standing at the end of some kind of hallway or corridor. The floor was littered with all kinds of trash and debris. There were about half a dozen other doors on either side, all of them steel, identical to the door of the room I had been imprisoned in, all of them shut. The corridor was about 20 feet long and opened up into a much wider space at the other end. I staggered uncertainly down the corridor and found myself on a wide, open floor of what seemed like a factory or a warehouse, one that looked long abandoned and derelict. Rusty, broken down machinery stood here and there, and heaps of junk were piled everywhere. The walls were tagged with graffiti, and the empty liquor bottles, beer cans and cigarette butts were a telltale sign this was a pretty popular squatting place for the local homeless population. I spotted something about 10 feet ahead of me and approached it for a closer look. A small, stainless steel table about the size of a TV dinner tray. It looked brand new and stood out in sharp contrast to the decrepit squalor surrounding it. Neatly arranged on its surface were 4 objects: my phone, wallet, keys, and a manila envelope. I reached instinctively for my phone to call 911, but hesitated, turning my attention to the manila envelope, curious. I opened it and took out its contents. 2 items. The first was a short, typed note. "Thank you for participating in our experiment and congratulations, Miss Norton." The second was a thick stack of $100 bills, bound with bank tape with $10,000 stamped on it. I began to laugh shrilly in the deserted, abandoned warehouse. Eventually my laughter turned to sobs, then back to laughter. I called 911 and told the dispatcher I had been abducted and didn't know where I was. They were able to pinpoint my location using my phone, and police and EMTs were sent. The cops were pretty skeptical, to put it mildly, when I told them my story. My disheveled appearance didn't help. They probably figured I was some crazy homeless guy strung out on drugs. Until they checked out my ID. Apparently my parents had reported me missing a week ago after I failed to answer several phone calls. I was taken to the hospital and kept there for a couple days, but apart from malnutrition I was fine. They never did find the people who did it. They investigated for weeks and even got the FBI involved, but it all led to dead ends. Apparently the office I had gone to had been leased by a dummy corporation who had paid cash and used bogus names. The police went there, but they had already packed up and taken off. No fingerprints, and no record of a Miss Norton having ever worked there. The warehouse was located in an industrial park on the other side of the city. It had been abandoned for years. They even tried to trace the money they had left me, which, unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to keep, but it was all old, non-sequential bills. They didn't find any clues at the warehouse, either, but they did find something else. Remember those other steel doors in the corridor I mentioned earlier? They led to rooms set up exactly like mine had been. Surveillance cameras, timers, speakers in the ceiling, and poison gas in the vents. There were 6 bodies found, 1 in each of the rooms, all people who had been unfortunate enough to answer that ZipRecruiter ad like I had and been found eligible to partake in the experiment. They had also been unfortunate enough to not solve their puzzles before their timers had run out. Each of them had been found hideously contorted, expressions of agony frozen on their faces, unsolved Rubik's cubes clutched in their stiff hands.